On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed.
Vice President Kamala Harris presiding over the U.S. Senate announcing the confirmation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. That applause coming mainly from the Democratic side, which supplied 50 of the 53 yes votes. Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, April 7th, 2022. U.S. Senate and House today passing bills to revoke normal trade relations status with Russia and also ban Russian energy imports as Russia's devastating war in Ukraine grinds on. The United Nations General Assembly voting to expel Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, with mounting allegations that Russia is committing war crimes against civilians in Ukraine. We'll talk about that with an editor at the new Statesman, about the many investigations into possible Russian war crimes and what it would take to actually bring them to trial. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi testing positive for coronavirus. Her spokesman says she's fully vaccinated and boosted, showing no symptoms. She was at the White House last night, White House saying the President Biden was not in close contact with her, and he is testing negative. Also, the House today passing a $55 billion bill to help restaurants and other small businesses which have suffered economic losses from the pandemic and did not qualify or could not get the money from previous efforts. New York Times writes the Senate on Thursday confirmed Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court, making her the first black woman to be elevated to the pinnacle of the judicial branch, in what her supporters hailed as a needed step toward bringing new diversity and life experience to the court. Overcoming a concerted effort by conservative Republicans to derail her nomination, Judge Jackson was confirmed on a 53-47 vote, with 3 Republicans joining all 50 Democrats in backing her. Those 3, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Mitt Romney from Utah. Here's some of the debate before the vote. Senator Raphael Warnock, Democrat from Georgia.
Under intense questioning before the committee, much of it appropriate and necessary, some of it outrageous and beyond the pale. She demonstrated her legal acumen, sharp intellect, and the kind of temperament we need on the bench, especially at a time like this. If there were any doubts about her character, she more than proved her poise, her skill, composure, and the depth of her patriotism through the process. Amazing grace under pressure. As a voice for Georgians in the Senate, I've said from the beginning that people in my state want someone on the court who is fair, eminently qualified, and has a record of protecting the constitutional rights and freedoms of Georgians and Americans. And that's why my office has received thousands of emails and phone calls from Georgians in every corner of our state voicing their support for Judge Jackson's confirmation. So after hearing from Georgians and thoroughly evaluating her nomination, I'm ecstatic to say that Judge Jackson is an excellent jurist who has the temperament and discernment to sit on our nation's highest court. Mr. President, the people of Georgia made this appointment possible by making history last year. So in addition to thanking Georgia for this moment, I want to acknowledge that the historic nature of her appointment isn't lost on me. Like my brother, Senator Booker, I know what it has taken for Judge Jackson to get to this moment, and nobody's going to steal my joy. Yes, I'm a senator. I'm a pastor. But beyond all of that, I'm the father of a young black girl. I know how much it means for Judge Jackson to have navigated the double jeopardy of racism and sexism to now stand in the glory of this moment in all of her excellence. for my 5-year-old daughter, and for so many young women in our country. But really, if we're thinking about it right, for all of us. Seeing Judge Jackson ascend to the Supreme Court reflects the promise of progress on which our democracy rests.
Senator Raphael Warnock, Democrat from Georgia, on the Senate floor before that vote to confirm Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Speaking in opposition, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee.
For judicial nominees, their philosophy ought to decide how to decide cases ought to be of primary consideration. Part of having a judicial philosophy is having an understanding of the fundamental principles of our Constitution. Natural rights are a part of that system. Judge Jackson explained to us that she does not, quote, hold a position on whether individuals possess natural rights. Now that ought to be very shocking. Natural rights are basic to our constitutional system and principles of limited government. Because we all know our country was founded on the belief that's expressed in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that was further nailed down in the Constitution of the United States. Our Constitution vests the three branches of government with very limited power. All other powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people thereof. The principle of limited government is what makes America an exceptional nation and sets our Constitution apart. Judges must have a proper understanding of those basic principles, and the way Judge Jackson answered those questions, particularly the answers she gave to Senator Cruz, shows that she lacks that very necessary foundation.
Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, on the Senate floor ahead of the vote to confirm Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. Again, it passed. She was confirmed 53-47, 3 Republicans joining the Democrats in voting yes. President Joe Biden tweeting a photo of himself and the nominee in the White House Roosevelt Room. Behind him, a TV of the Senate coverage of the vote from C-SPAN 2's live coverage. President writing on the tweet, Judge Jackson confirmation was a historic moment for our nation. We've taken another step toward making our highest court reflect the diversity of America. She will be an incredible justice, and I am honored to share this moment with her. And White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki leading off her briefing with this.
Obviously, this is a tremendously historic day in the White House and in the country, and this is a fulfillment of a promise the President made to the country. His time on the Judiciary Committee was defining for him and gave him historically exceptional preparation for what we would consider a smooth process characterized by heavy engagement with both parties in the Senate during both the advice and consent phases. He promised to choose a successor in the mold of Justice Breyer, as Republicans and Democrats called for, and after thorough consideration, as you know, chose Judge Jackson. The President's outreach, Justice Jackson, I guess we can now call her. The President's outreach continued at this stage, calling senators in both parties early about his choice. Out of the gate, he proved he had chosen someone in the tradition by immediately getting endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police and Judge Thomas Griffith, followed by a procession of leading conservative legal minds and additional law enforcement organizations. As we've talked about in here a bit, she began her prep work immediately, starting the day after she was announced, and promised to meet with anyone who wanted to and honored it, meeting with 97 senators over the course of her consultations. She further displayed her work ethic, extraordinary credentials, and character when she testified for over 20 hours and answered the most QFRs of any SCOTUS nominee ever. We also functioned seamlessly with the Judiciary Committee and leadership, and we were conscientious about being a good resource to Republicans. Senator Jones and the additional staff brought on during the process made invaluable contributions essential to success.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki with reporters in the White House briefing room. Ketanji Brown Jackson will be taking her seat on the Supreme Court after the current term ends, expected in June. That's when the Associate Justice Stephen Breyer said that he planned to retire. And so she'll be hearing cases starting with the next term, October 3rd. It begins 2022. President Biden plans to make some remarks about the confirmation along with Judge Jackson, now Justice in Waiting Jackson, on Friday at the White House, 12:15 p.m. Eastern. We'll have live coverage on C-SPAN Radio. This from the Associated Press. Congress voted overwhelmingly Thursday to suspend normal trade relations with Russia and ban the importation of its oil, ratcheting up the U.S. response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine amid reports of atrocities. House action came after the Senate approved the two bills with 100-0 votes. The measures now go to President Joe Biden to be signed into law. Lawmakers overwhelmingly support the substance of the two bills, but they had languished for weeks in the Senate as lawmakers worked to hammer out the final details. That from AP. Right before the votes, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, spoke on the floor.
On the final day of the work period, the Senate is going to pass a much-needed, a much-sought-after piece of legislation, revoking Russia a permanent normal trade relation with the United States. The legislation will go a long way to landing a painful, severe blow on Putin's economy. It will hinder his ability to keep funding his war machine and adds Russia as well as Belarus to a list of nations, including North Korea, that are ineligible for free trade with the United States. I want to thank my colleague from Idaho, Senator Crapo, for working so closely with me on into the night last night to make sure that this got done. We will also vote separately on legislation regarding an oil ban, and I thank my colleagues who worked together to reach a compromise on this measure. We are moving forward today. Putin must absolutely be held accountable for the detestable and despicable war crimes he is committing against Ukraine. The images we have seen coming out of that country, most recently out of the town of Bucha, are pure, pure evil. Hundreds of civilians murdered in cold blood. Dozens of bodies of men, women, children, the elderly, the defenseless, people with hands tied behind their backs and left dead in the streets. Some of the bodies showed signs of torture. According to a new report by Der Spiegel, German intelligence now believes that some of these murders were discussed by Russian troops over radio intercepts. And why were these people killed? Simply because they were Ukrainians. So many were children, civilians, young people, women. No nation whose military is committing war crimes deserves free trade status with the United States. Let me say that again. No nation whose military is committing war crimes deserves free trade status with the United States. No vile thug like Putin deserves to stand as an equal with the leaders of the free world. He is a menace and a pariah who has ensured that his place in history will be one of everlasting shame.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor right before the votes on those two bills, suspending normal trade relations with Russia and banning energy imports from Russia. They passed 100-0. Then it was over to the House, giving its final approval later in the day. Here's Congressman Kevin Brady of Texas. He's ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, which deals with trade issues.
Mr. Speaker, the Senate has finally taken action. Now we can move forward on our bill to answer President Zelensky's passionate plea to the United States and all free nations to stand with the brave people of Ukraine against Putin's deadly ambitions and heartbreaking genocide. Putin's onslaught has been relentless. Beautiful town squares have been leveled, families and children killed, families abused. The bill we send to the President today will stop American dollars from funding Russia's bloodletting. Today, Mr. Speaker, we are leading, and I thank Chairman Neal for his great leadership and his work on this bipartisan provision to suspend Russia's special trade status. I was proud to have helped lead this bipartisan effort of the Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees, both parties in Congress came together, worked in good faith on a bipartisan bicameral agreement to immediately ban purchases of Russian energy and suspend our trading relationship with Russia and Belarus. We don't take these steps lightly, but Russia's aggression requires this approach. Russia will no longer enjoy the same special trade status with America as the country it is invading. So it will no longer be able to sell made in Russia products in the United States at lower tariffs. And combined with the energy import ban, which targets 60% Russia sells us, this provision targets the remaining 40%, hurting Russia's economy and cutting off funding for its war effort. Said another way, American dollars will no longer fund Russia's war machine.
Congressman Kevin Brady on the House floor. The House went on to pass the Suspending Normal Trade Relations with Russia bill 420-3 and banning Russian energy imports 413-9. And so, with past the House, past the Senate, now heads to President Biden for signature. CNBC points out when it comes to that trade bill, it's a formal step to sever normal trade relations with Russia and Belarus to allow import controls on key products like platinum, chemicals, iron, and steel. They write the U.S. has already severed its normal trade relations with Moscow in practice. The Biden administration moved to ban imports of oil, vodka, diamonds, and seafood from Russia last month. And CNBC on that other bill to ban the energy imports, they write it comes nearly a month after President Biden signed an executive order that mandated essentially the same steps. The Senate bill codifies Biden's order into law, making it more difficult for a future president to reverse it. The United Nations General Assembly, made up of all the nations that belong to the UN, over 190 of them, voting today to suspend Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council following the allegations of atrocities committed by Russian soldiers in the war in Ukraine. The vote was 93 nations in favor, 24 against, 58 abstentions. The resolution, introduced by Ukraine's ambassador to the UN, Sergei Kizlytsya.
Suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council is not an option, but a duty. And let me quote how this duty is formulated in the operative paragraph 8 of Resolution 60/251, and I quote, "The General Assembly may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights," end of quote. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's not an option. It is what the resolution prescribes. We view voting to suspend a state's Human Rights Council rights as a rare and extraordinary action. However, Russia's actions are beyond the pale. Russia is not only committing human rights violations, it is shaking the underpinnings of international peace and security. A draft resolution on the matter under A/ES 11/L4 is a result of the collective effort of a cross-regional group of 24 states that represent all regions. It has been co-sponsored so far by more than 50 UN member states. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft.
Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations, Sergei Kizlytsya, at the UN in New York City before that successful vote to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Reuters reports that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the United States is sustaining and building its pressure on Russia as he warned that there are more credible reports of torture, rape, and killings by Russian forces in Ukraine. Blinken, speaking to reporters at NATO following a meeting of foreign ministers, said there is a growing coalition of countries with Ukraine and against Russia. That from Reuters. Blinken also at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, speaking about the formal process to hold Russia accountable for possible war crimes.
The United States continues to work methodically to collect, to preserve, to analyze evidence of atrocities, and to make this information available to the appropriate bodies. We're supporting a multinational team of experts that's assisting a war crimes unit set up by Ukraine's prosecutor general with a view toward eventually pursuing criminal accountability. These efforts will also ensure that Russia cannot escape the verdict of history.
With more on the alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine, we're joined on the phone by Emily Tamkins, senior editor for the U.S. with the new Statesman. Thank you for being here. A key line in an article you just wrote, calling for the investigation of war crimes is one thing, actually investigating them and prosecuting war crimes is another. Take us through some of the challenges and hurdles.
I think there are really two main challenges. The first is just the collection and preservation of evidence of apparent war crimes, and identifying who carried out the war crimes. Because remember, it's not enough to say Russia did war crimes. You need to bring a case against an individual and show that they were the one who carried this out. And this can take many years. It's made even more difficult in this case because there's obviously an ongoing war. That is the first thing. The second thing is that the perpetrators need to actually be arrested and in person to be prosecuted. So that obviously brings with it its own complications because people do evade arrest for years or, forever in some cases.
There are a lot of separate investigations going on right now. If a trial actually takes place, where will it be taking place, and will everything funnel into that place?
Well, this is another part of it, right? Is that it's one thing to allocate resources to this. There's also the challenge of coordinating because Ukraine has announced investigations. Various independent countries, or third-party countries have announced investigations. The ICC has too. Normally, the higher-profile cases would probably go through the International Criminal Court, but this is also an issue, right? Who and there are groups like Human Rights Watch is trying to collect evidence right now. So trying to figure out who collects evidence, where exactly the prosecutions would take place, that's a whole other issue as well, and one that's not separated from geopolitics, right?
You mentioned that actually arresting somebody is a requirement. There's a very good possibility that Russian President Vladimir Putin will still be in power if this ever reaches a trial stage. So is there any precedent for a sitting head of state being tried or being tried in absentia?
This is a huge wrinkle in all of this, is that it's very possible that they are able to, that investigators and prosecutors are able to bring sort of mid-tier people to justice, but that Putin and Lavrov and Shoigu and the people who are really ultimately responsible for this war, that they are not. Now, obviously, there are, in the cases of the Yugoslav wars, some of the most senior people were eventually brought to justice. But I think we might see in Russia's case a different situation in that we don't actually, short of Russia, short of Vladimir Putin being forced out of power, it is extremely unlikely, in my opinion, that they will be able to physically bring him to be tried. Now, there is a possibility that Russia could be tried, that could be accused of crimes of aggression, except that Russia is not a state party to the International Criminal Court, and so, which the United States also is not. And so we already have limited buy-in from Russia's side into international criminal law, and that makes all of this more difficult as well.
We're talking with Emily Tamkins from the New Statesman. The concept of a war crime and crime against humanity only dates from World War II. Roughly how many trials have there been since the war, World War II? How long have they taken, and what's the conviction rate? So as we're looking at Russia, what's the history of this?
I mean, I think it's also important to remember that the International Criminal Court was only founded in 2002, right? So the concept only dates back to World War II, but this institution only goes back 20 years. The International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia obviously came out of the wars in the 1990s. But this is really, it's very rare for somebody to actually be brought to justice for committing a war crime or a crime against humanity. It's not only because it's a more recent phenomenon in human history, but because of, as we were talking about, all of the practical hurdles. There are people in the case of the Yugoslav wars who were only convicted last year in 2021. And those wars took place in the 1990s. There were, in the case of the Georgian war in 2008, there were people who were only recently, announced that they were going to be prosecuted. So it does take, it just takes so long. And again, I can't stress enough that the further complication here is that the war is currently ongoing. So you have war crimes, apparent war crimes being committed while you're trying to collect evidence, while you're trying to figure out who to investigate and who to prosecute, and all the while knowing, at least the people who were involved in this work know that it's going to take years to bring anybody to justice.
Emily Tamkins is a senior editor for the U.S. with the New Statesman. You can find her article at newstatesman.com. Follow her on Twitter at Emily C. Tamkin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Washington Today. Back to Secretary of State Antony Blinken meeting with reporters in Brussels, Belgium at NATO headquarters after he met with the foreign ministers of NATO countries. Blinken saying today the U.S. is not going to let anything stand in the way of sending Ukraine more of the weapons it needs in its fight against Russia.
The United States continues to work at an unprecedented pace to help Ukraine defend itself. Last Friday, the Department of Defense announced $300 million in new security assistance. On Tuesday, I authorized an additional $100 million to meet Ukraine's urgent needs for more Javelin anti-armor systems. This will bring total U.S. security assistance to Ukraine since the beginning of Russia's invasion in February to over $1.7 billion and over $2.4 billion since January of last year. More than 30 countries have joined us in delivering security assistance to Ukraine, aid that our Ukrainian partners are putting to very effective use, as we see in the Kremlin's retreat from Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities and towns. Today, I met again with my colleague and friend Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, to discuss how we can continue to provide Ukraine's courageous defenders with what they need to keep pushing Russia back.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken with reporters at NATO headquarters in Brussels. The Pentagon spokesman, Press Secretary John Kirby, was asked this week about U.S. military leaders speaking about a long war between Russia and Ukraine, a long slog, they said, lasting perhaps years, and whether that means the Pentagon believes that Ukraine cannot win. And Kirby answered, of course they can win this. The proof is literally in the outcomes that you're seeing every day. Absolutely, they can win. Today on Capitol Hill, Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, asked Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin why he and the person testifying next to him, General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did not use the word win.
Secretary Austin, why will you not say the words win and victory when it comes to Ukraine? Senator Blumenthal just gave an impassioned speech about this. It's clear that it's what both parties want. I reviewed your written testimony. You talk about deterrence 29 times. You never once used the word win or victory in reference to Ukraine, nor does the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Vice President, the President. Have the words win and victory been purged from the administration's vocabulary when it comes to Ukraine?
The words win has certainly not been purged from our vocabulary.
Do you want Ukraine to win, or do you want this war merely to end?
I think the chairman pointed out very accurately what a desired end state would be. Ukraine maintains its sovereignty and its ability to protect its country, defend itself. It maintains its government. Russia is weakened militarily. And Russia, from a geopolitical standpoint, is a pariah, and countries will not volunteer to align itself with Russia. Some of that will happen, but we can see those kind of things beginning to happen.
Okay, I thought that the chairman's response to Senator Gillibrand was pretty good on this point about what Ukraine winning looked like, a free and independent Ukraine with sovereignty and control over its own territory. Does that include the territory that Russia or Russian proxies controlled in the Donbass as of February 24th, the day before the invasion?
I think it's appropriate to let President Zelensky and the government of Ukraine define what that is going forward.
Are you or anyone else in the administration discouraging President Zelensky or your counterparts from launching attacks that would involve taking back any part of the Donbass or the Crimea?
No.
Are you providing them intelligence to conduct such attacks?
We are providing them intelligence to conduct operations in the Donbass. That's correct.
In the Donbass on the territory that Russia or its proxies controlled before the invasion.
Yeah, and we want to make
offensive operations to reclaim their own territory. Are you providing that intelligence to
we
them?
want to make sure that's clear to our force, and so that updated guidance that goes out today. We'll make sure that that's clear.
Updated guidance. So that means that the current guidance has said don't provide that information.
Certainly, the current guidance was not clear in that regard, so we'll make sure it's clear.
I think this is part of what you've heard from both parties in this committee is that as much as we have done, we're still engaged in too many half measures. There's still too much hesitancy and tentativeness in our posture towards this war.
Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, questioning Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and General Mark Milley is also there. He referenced them, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at today's Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. It was about President Biden's fiscal year 2023 budget proposal for defense, but a lot of questions about Russia and Ukraine. Senator Cotton referencing Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut. You can find the full hearing on our website at cspan.org. CNN writes about the exchange you just heard that Defense Secretary Austin said publicly for the first time that the U.S. is providing intelligence to Ukrainian forces to conduct operations in the Donbass region. It's the first time a U.S. official has publicly acknowledged the U.S. role in Ukraine's operations in the contested region as the fighting shifts away from the capital of Kyiv and towards southeast Ukraine. Washington Today continues in a minute.
Book TV, every Sunday on C-SPAN 2, features leading authors discussing their latest nonfiction books. At 2 p.m. Eastern, from the New Orleans Book Festival at Tulane University, author and historian discussions, including historians Walter Isaacson and John Barry, Eddie Glaude and John Meacham, on the legacies of James Baldwin and John Lewis, and authors on race and history with Jarvis DeBerry, Clint Smith, and Mitch Landrieu. And at 10 p.m. Eastern, on Afterwards, former Australian Prime Minister and Asia Society President and CEO Kevin Rudd talks about his book, The Avoidable War, and his thoughts on how the U.S. and China can coexist and avoid a war in the future. He's interviewed by United States Institute of Peace senior expert on China, Carla Freeman. Watch Book TV every Sunday on C-SPAN 2, and find a full schedule on your program guide, or watch online anytime at booktv.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. Moments before House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was to start her weekly news conference today, a spokesman, Drew Hamill, issued this statement. After testing negative this week, Speaker Pelosi received a positive test result for COVID-19 and is currently asymptomatic. The Speaker is fully vaccinated and boosted and is thankful for the robust protection the vaccine has provided. The Speaker will quarantine consistent with CDC guidance and encourages everyone to get vaccinated, boosted, and tested regularly. The news conference was canceled, as was her planned trip to Asia with other House members. Pelosi was at the White House this week with the president without a mask. The White House says the two had brief interactions over the course of the last 2 days, and the president has tested negative. Some questions about this at the White House briefing to Press Secretary Jen Psaki.
The president obviously tested negative today, and according to CDC guidelines.
Yesterday.
Yesterday.
Yes.
And Speaker Pelosi was not considered a close contact, but it seems like a very close call. I know you've said that he had a second booster and that he's following CDC guidelines, but given the importance of his role and his age, is the White House considering any stricter measures to keep him safe? More mask wearing, fewer big venue events, more outdoor events?
Well, when you say it's a close call, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Close call in the sense that they were in 2 events at the White House together within 2 days. She tested positive.
Sure. Okay. Well, for clarity purposes, the way a close contact is defined, it's not arbitrary. It's not something made up by the White House. It's CDC guidelines, and how they define it is being within 6 feet for a cumulative total of 15 minutes over a 24-hour period. that they were not. All of their interactions were publicly available. I think you saw them. And that's how that assessment is made. In terms of additional testing or anything along those lines, those assessments would be made by the president's doctor. He was tested last evening and tested negative. We have incredibly stringent protocols here at the White House that we keep in place to keep the president safe, to keep everybody safe. Those go over and above CDC guidelines, and that includes ensuring that anyone who is going to be around the president is tested. Every member of the staff is on a regular testing protocol. If you're going to see him in person, whether you're traveling with him or you're meeting in the Oval Office, you will be tested. We try to do socially distanced meetings when necessary. For those employees who test positive, they are required to isolate, of course, in alignment with CDC guidance, must test negative before returning to work. That is also a step that goes over and above. But we are going to continue to follow the protocols. And I would remind you and reiterate that we also put out a plan just a month ago that made clear that, well, COVID-19 will continue to be with us, and we will see cases rise and fall, as we are seeing them rise now, to be expected given the transmissibility of BA2. We now have steps to go back to many of our normal routines in alignment with what the CDC continues to recommend.
The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki in the White House briefing room. In addition to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi testing positive, several other members of Congress this week also saying they have tested positive for COVID-19. And two of President Biden's cabinet secretaries also testing positive, Attorney General Merrick Garland and Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. On Capitol Hill, the U.S. House passing a bill to provide $42 billion to help restaurants recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic fallout from that. Also, the bill has another $13 billion for other hard-hit small businesses. The money for the restaurants is to replenish an existing fund because the number of restaurants applying was over twice what the appropriation could handle. The other money for the hard-hit businesses is a new fund. Speaking on the House floor supporting the bill, Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, Democrat from New York. She chairs the Small Business Committee.
Last year, Congress created the RRF under the American Rescue Plan to provide targeted relief to struggling small restaurants. The program delivered emergency aid to over 100,000 employers in communities across the country. These grants were a critical lifeline and allow businesses to keep their lights on and continue to pay their employees. Despite the program's success, approximately 177,000 small businesses are still awaiting relief. While these companies are dispersed throughout the country, they are united by a common message, that small firms are still hurting and they are counting on Congress for more support. That is why we must act to replenish the RRF and deliver long-awaited aid to hundreds of thousands of restaurants across the country. H.R. 3807 also takes the crucial step of creating a new $13 billion hard-hit industry award program, which will extend aid to businesses with the greatest revenue losses that were ineligible or unable to access relief through other means. Rather than picking winners and losers, this industry-neutral program makes hard-hit companies the priority. These programs are offset by utilizing recovered money from fraud cases in the pandemic relief programs. Congress will take the money that was fraudulently obtained and put it in the hands of small businesses that need it the most.
Democratic Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, Small Business Committee Chair, on the House floor. To qualify for aid, businesses must have under 200 employees and have experienced at least 40% revenue loss in 2020 and 2021 compared to 2019. Opposing this bill on the House floor, Congressman Roger Williams, Republican from Texas.
Now, this attempt by Democrats to spend billions of tax dollars is irresponsible and will only add to what we have today and to the growing inflation crisis that we have. Americans are currently experiencing tough times right now, trying to find out how to beat, frankly, the federal government. Inflation and energy prices are the primary concerns for small businesses, and I'm a small business owner for 51 years, still employ hundreds of people. And so that's the concerns they have, and more federal spending is only going to strain businesses further. It is simple. To lower costs for hardworking families and businesses and owners of those businesses, we need to cut spending. We need to cut it, not spend more money that we don't have. When you spend money you print, you spend money you don't have, it's called inflation. We should be focusing on getting control of the crisis at the southern border, lowering gas prices, managing supply chain disruptions. I'm in the car business, I can talk about that are leaving shelves empty, and incentivizing people to get back to work, not to work. In order to get back to the thriving economy we had pre-pandemic under the Trump administration, Democrats must end this emergency COVID spending charade. Hey, it's over. We're done with it. Let's move on. And they always get a kick out of people that say they want to protect Main Street. Well, it's funny because a lot of those people wanting to protect Main Street are bureaucrats that never signed the front of a check. They never met a payroll. They've been up here all their life, but they want to help Main Street. And the fact of the matter is, we need to cut taxes. We need to cut regulations.
Republican Congressman Roger Williams on the House floor. The House went on to pass this bill 223 to 203. It was mostly along party lines. Democrats yes, Republicans no. But 4 Democrats voted no, 6 Republicans voted yes. The Senate is ending the week and going on a 2-week recess without voting on that $10 billion bill for COVID-19 vaccines, tests, and research. The total amount was negotiated between Republicans and Democrats, but there's still disagreement over whether Republicans should be allowed to offer an amendment dealing with immigration. They want to prevent President Biden from terminating Title 42, which has allowed Border Patrol along the U.S.-Mexico border to deny migrants asylum claims during the pandemic. Wall Street today, the Dow up 87, NASDAQ up 8, and S&P up 19. Labor Department says new weekly claims for unemployment insurance fell last week to 166,000. It's the lowest level since 1968. And the Biden administration touting an announcement from the International Energy Agency that its member countries will release 60 million barrels of oil from their emergency reserves on top of the previous U.S. pledges in order to try to bring down energy prices that have soared since Russia invaded Ukraine. There are 31 member nations in the IEA. Back in the U.S., federal tax filing deadline coming soon. Most of the country, it's April 18th this year instead of the usual 15th because the 15th is a holiday in Washington, D.C., Emancipation Day. And residents of Massachusetts and Maine, they get an extra day. They can file on the 19th because the 18th is a holiday there, Patriots' Day. Today, the IRS Commissioner Charles Reddick testifying before the Senate Finance Committee. The committee chair, Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, asking him about IRS customer service, what happens when you call, and also the work to deal with the massive backlog of more than 20 million unprocessed returns, including filings from previous years.
Timeline to eliminate backlogs. We talked a bit about this, and I think I'd really like to get your sense here. In your view, what is a reasonable level of phone service, and when will the agency reach that level?
The president's budget proposal for fiscal 23 requests $389 million with a target level of service of 85%, so answering 8.5 out of 10 calls. Every IRS employee would like to answer 10 out of 10 calls, and the surge in incoming volume of phone calls has obviously had a huge impact, and I think you're all aware at one point we were receiving phone calls at the rate of 1,500 per second, 1,500 calls per second, and that built up such an inventory and a backlog, and we've never recovered from that.
So what's a reasonable
85%.
What's a reasonable expectation for Americans on phone service?
We need to crush our inventories, our paper inventories. We need to crush our return backlog because the folks who answer the phones also process paper. So when we can get through the paper, we can get all those folks full-time back onto the phones and handling it. And we're committed to getting into that position by the end of calendar year 22.
Let me do one other one. You and I have talked about technology, policy, and this has been a focus of my work. I showed up in the Senate where basically nobody was using a computer, and I understand the backlog is due to a great extent to the fact that the IRS employees have to transcribe paper returns manually. So when, in your view, can we expect the IRS to start using scanning technology to transcribe individual tax returns? And how does the president's budget affect that?
The president's budget supports our ability to scan and electronically convert paper into something that we can actually do machine readable and hopefully process automatically. I should say, with respect to the 2D barcode, the congressional budget justification for each year between 2013 and 2017 requested funding for 2D barcode, and that funding was never provided, and the agency then pivoted into focusing on electronic filing, and we're currently running around 96% e-filed income tax returns in our current filing season.
The IRS Commissioner Charles Rettig being questioned by Senator Ron Wyden, chair of the Finance Committee, at today's hearing. This Saturday, April 9th, IRS is offering to provide support to taxpayers in person at taxpayer assistance centers around the country, first time in 2 years. You can make an appointment at irs.gov.
There goes Ortega. Strike, throw down to second. Tag. Got him.
Video tweet this afternoon from Major League Baseball, and they add, "Baseball is back, baby." #opening day. C-SPAN recently covered a lecture by Pepperdine University professor Loretta Honeycutt about baseball during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and she talks about the impact of radio coverage on baseball during that decade.
One other way, though, that we see the impact of media on baseball is in radio. And what's interesting here is the owners initially reject the idea of broadcasting games on the radio. So you had coverage in newspapers, but why not radio? Well, and why would the owners initially reject that idea? Of course, many of you could probably figure it out. They're afraid nobody shows up to the ballpark if you broadcast the games on the radio. So initially, not a lot of owners accepting that possibility. But you have your first radio broadcast in Pittsburgh in 1921, and it's pretty quickly followed by the Giant Yankees World Series being broadcast in 1921. It was the first time people all over the country could experience the same baseball game at the same time. But the greatest growth of radio would be in the 1930s, hence me throwing this in with the Great Depression. Radio was essentially one way to attend games for free. And I'll say more about the Depression in a little bit and set up why this was so important, but you can well imagine. So many people had lost their jobs, the economy is in a sense of crisis for a whole host of reasons. And so the idea that you could attend a game for free, on the radio, really reflected the Depression-era economy and really explains its popularity. And in fact, by 1939, all of Major League teams broadcast their games, particularly once they figured out that they could get paid for the right to do so. They could offer the right to broadcast the game to a radio station in exchange for a contract payment. And that seemed to make it work for everybody. And what they learned then was that essentially broadcasting games on the radio helped popularize Major League Baseball teams, even among fans who did not attend games.
Loretta Honeycutt, Pepperdine University professor on C-SPAN's American History TV Lectures in History. You can find her full lecture on baseball during the Great Depression at C-SPAN's video library, cspan.org. Today is opening day of the new season. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get Washington's top stories sent right to you each day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word. You can sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.